These are Sermons from the Mount. Mount Gambier Catholic Parish, that is. This is the Sunday Gospel and our short reflection on it. I pray the Word of God bring each of us closer to Jesus, the Word made flesh. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. As he prayed, the aspect of his face was changed, and his clothing became brilliant as lightning. Suddenly, there were two men talking to him. They were Moses and Elijah appearing in glory. And they were speaking of his passing, which he was to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were heavy with sleep. But they kept awake and saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As these were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is wonderful for us to be here. So let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. As he spoke, a cloud came and covered them with shadow. And when they went into the cloud, the disciples were afraid. And a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my Son, the chosen one. Listen to him." And after the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. The disciples kept silence, and at that time told no one what they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. So this second Sunday of Lent, we always read one of the accounts of Jesus' transfiguration. And it's a rather strange event. We hear about this light emanating from Jesus' face. We hear about Moses and Elijah having a chat. We hear about Peter wanting to build tents. And it's all very odd. And I think what we need to do to get a good sense of what's going on with the Transfiguration is use a few little bits from the Old Testament, kind of hooks, if you like, that will help to unravel some of the symbolism of what's happening in this moment. So the first thing we hear is that Jesus, with his face transfigured, with this light emanating brilliant like lightning from his face and from his clothing, he then starts talking to Moses and Elijah. Now, these two figures, Moses is the one through whom we receive the law, Elijah, the great prophet. What's symbolized here is the law and the prophets now, the whole of the Old Testament now speaking about Jesus and pointing towards him. But the second thing to note about Moses and Elijah is both of them had mountaintop experiences of the presence of God. Famously, Moses goes up Mount Sinai and encounters God in the burning bush. Elijah does the same thing. He goes up Mount Sinai, up Mount Horeb as it's known as well, and there he has these powerful experiences of nature. We hear that there's a powerful wind, there's an earthquake, there's a fire, and God's not in any of these, but in a gentle breeze. That's where Elijah experiences the holy presence of God. Now see what's happening. Jesus takes with him Peter, James, and John, goes up a mountain, and there we have Elijah and Moses. These two figures who encountered God are now once again encountering God, but this time in the person of Jesus. Jesus is indeed God's holy presence in their midst. In the conversation we hear in the Gospel this morning that they're speaking about the passing of Jesus, which he will accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, when we hear that word passing, we might imagine that it's referring to Jesus passing away. They're going to speak about Jesus' death in Jerusalem. But that's not exactly what it says. The translation we've got here is a little bit loose. In actual fact, what they're talking about is the exodus that Jesus is going to accomplish in Jerusalem. The departure that Jesus is going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, the Exodus, of course, we know full well. When Israel was held captive in slavery in Egypt, God came with power and with might and rescued them from this slavery, and then through a 40-year journey in the wilderness, accompanied the people of Israel all the way into the promised land. That somehow what Jesus is about to accomplish in Jerusalem is a new exodus. That the way God rescued his people from slavery, he's going to do once more. The way God brought people into the promised land, he's going to do once more. And Moses and Elijah are both pointing towards Jesus as the one who is going to fulfill this new great saving action of God. Maybe this explains a little bit why Peter gets a little bit overcome and says, let's just make 3 tents. In the Jewish custom, they celebrated around autumn a major feast called the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tents. And in actual fact, they still celebrate this feast day today. And what Jewish people will do is build a little hut just outside their home, in their garden, in their backyard, on their veranda. They'll take palm branches and they'll take other items from nature and they'll build a little tent. And then for 7 days, live in this tent. And this feast day is to remind everyone that God lived with us. For 40 years, he lived in a tent with us, walking step by step as we arrived in the promised land. This kind of sense that indeed God not only rescued us, but he walked along on our journey and brought us all the way into the place that he had promised us. Let's build 3 tents. Let's have this moment of Sukkoth, this Feast of Tabernacles, this feast of God's dwelling place among us. Peter here seems to have this sense that indeed there is a new exodus that's coming about, and God indeed is dwelling with us, is walking with us. Let's make 3 tents. Well, a cloud then descends upon them, and there's a lot to say about the cloud. But once that's done, it all goes back to normal. They walk down the hill and they continue their journey towards Jerusalem. When we get to Passover night, Jesus celebrates this Last Supper with his disciples. And then, going off to pray, he takes with him Peter, James, and John and goes up a mountain. This time, the mountain of Olives. But instead of going into a moment of ecstatic prayer, instead what Jesus enters into is a moment of agonizing prayer, of sweating blood. And once more, these disciples, heavy with sleep, are drawn into this moment of revelation. And it's almost as if this moment of the transfiguration is supposed to give them a little bit of a jolt right now, to be able to say, look, what they were talking about, this exodus that Jesus would accomplish in Jerusalem, it's coming about now. This action of salvation and of being brought into the promised land, this is what Jesus is going to accomplish. Peter, James, and John are kind of invited to peer beneath the appearances. Look beneath the suffering. Look beneath the agony to to see what it is that Jesus is indeed accomplishing. It's an exodus, a freeing, and an invitation into God's new promised land. This is God dwelling with us. This is God in our midst. This is God accomplishing his great work of salvation. I suppose for us, we're a little bit in that in-between time now. That having had this experience of Jesus' transfiguration, having had this put in front of us, well, now, once again, the light disappears and we ourselves go down the mountain once more to walk day by day, step by step with Jesus. We're on that journey in our Lenten period towards Jerusalem and towards this exodus which Jesus is going to accomplish. And I suppose, like Peter, James and John, we're being invited to see beneath the outwards appearances at what God is truly accomplishing. To walk step by step with Jesus and to understand that this is in fact God with us. When we do this, we'll arrive at Holy Week. And we'll arrive at the celebration of the Lord's Supper. We'll come to Good Friday and we'll find ourselves on Holy Saturday, recognizing that Jesus here is accomplishing a new exodus. This is our freedom from the slavery of sin and death. And this is the invitation into the new promised land, which is the dwelling place of God.
Thanks for joining us for this Sunday's Gospel. May God bless you for the week ahead.